Alright, let's get started. Building on our useContext episode, we're going to quickly put together a very simple podcast player with Google Log In, podcast player, and some basic note-taking functions.
That list.
Windows on your car?
No, I can't watch any part of a car. That got added to the list long ago.
Disclaimer. This note-taking part is more for display purposes to indicate the possibilities attached to it. If you're familiar with React to-do apps, you can build it out, no problem at all. To practice, you can use local storage, but in reality, you'd be hooking up your user and their notes with a database.
How many, Twitter has been breaking in weird, subtle ways. So it's like, it could have been just like, something was messed up and no one knew. I mean, again, the way they did this, I like how Jason Snell put it.
So I've created the React app and installed Tailwind CSS. Now we can get going with the Google login. I don't think I need to explain what a Google login is. If we're here, we've probably all seen it. It's an OAuth. It sounds really weird with a British accent. It's an open authorization system that basically allows the user to interact with another application on your behalf without giving away their password. It's a great way to bypass the sign-up form system, as Google does all of the heavy lifting for us. And of course, in real life, you'd want to give the user a few options, which will depend on the nature of your app. For example, you could use Facebook, Apple, GitHub if it's something particularly developer related. There are many options out there, but we're using Google today. So first of all, we need to register our project with Google Cloud Platform. So that's console.cloud.google.com. We go into APIs and services, then credentials, and create project. I'll link the documentation below as well if you wanted to have a look. And in creating a project, we need to give the project name. So let's say Learn with Podcasts, and we don't need an organization for this. Give it a minute to set up, and then once ready, click on Configure Consent Screen. This is the OAuth consent screen. And we want to select External. Give it your app name, and enter your user support email as well as developer contact information down below. I've used my new Check for Bias Gmail account that I created for my side project, but you obviously enter your own email address. And then we need to enter test user email addresses. As you can see, whilst publishing status is set to testing, only test users can access the app. So whilst you're building your app and testing it on localhost, you can only use the email addresses that you've added here. You can add more than one, but not more than 100. Then click on Back to Dashboard at the bottom. You can see at the top here, you have the option to publish the app, but before then, you are in testing mode and can only access the login functions using the email addresses that you've provided. So then we go into credentials on the left here and create credentials at the top. We want the OAuth client ID. Application type is web application. You can give it a name, but I'm just going to leave it as web client 1. For our authorized JavaScript origins and redirect URIs, we need to add both the localhost address and the localhost 3000 address. If you're using the default React port number, that is. If you're using a different port number, you need to add that in here. Click on Create, and it gives you your client ID and your client secret ID. For our little app today, we only need the client ID. You can copy it now or later, up to you. Back to our VS Code, we need to go into our public folder and index.html. This is where all of the metadata and all of that boilerplate HTML stuff lives. As Google Identity Services, which is where we're getting our Google login from, runs an external script, we need to add a script source here. And if you don't know it yet, this title here is the name displayed on your browser tab. We can change it to say, Learn with Podcasts. It's cut off from my screen, but you'll see it on yours. The script source is given by the documentation. I'll also paste it below. And we need async and defer here. And that's it. That's all the setup done. Now we can go back to our app.js and start using our Google login system. We need to have an useEffect. And because we're using an external script for this login system, the first thing we need to do is add this global Google comment. Otherwise, when we start writing out the next line, google.accounts.id.initialize, our linter is going to complain that Google doesn't exist. Because the linter doesn't know that once we run our app, because our external script is going to run first, the Google object will exist by the time our external script has run. So we just need to send a message to our linter, telling them that, hey, it's okay. Then we initialize with our client ID and a callback function. Let's call it handle callback. This function basically handles what happens when someone logs in. The client ID is the client ID that we've saved, so we just need to paste it here. We'll go back to handle callback function a bit later. For now, let's render the button. We need to tell it where to render this button. In the pure JavaScript way, we can get element by ID. Let's say the ID of sign in, which we'll create afterwards. Then we can set the theme and size of the button. The documentation shows you what other variations of theme and size you can have, so feel free to check it out and switch it up if you want to. And down here, we just need to add a div with the ID of sign in. Let's finish the functionality first and then come back to upgrading this to useRef so you can see how getElementById is translated into useRef. Now our callback function. As mentioned before, it handles what happens after a user logs in. So that means we'll get a response, res. The response will give us the user's credentials. For now, let's just console log it to see what it throws up. You can see, as alluded to by my console log comment, you get an encoded token, aka the JSON Web Token, JWT. This token gives us a series of user information, like their name, their Google profile picture, etc. But how do we get that information? We need to decode it first. So let's do npm install jwt-decode. Then in our app, we import jwt_decode from jwt-decode. This _jwt-decode is simply a function that helps us to decode the token. In our handle callback function, let user equals jwt_decode parentheses our res.credential. If we console log it now, we can see the encoded version above and now our decoded version below. And there you go. We have my name amongst other information. Now that we have our user object, we can store it in our React app via useState. You know the drill. Let's display it on our page now for the pure satisfaction of seeing it work. So if there is a user, we'll show the image and name. Great. We have the profile photo and the name. We want to differentiate the screen based on whether a user has logged in, right? Like a changing sign in, log out button. There are various ways of doing this. This is one that I always go back to because I personally find it easier. So we have a Boolean state of whether a user is logged in or not. The default value is false. Then in our handle callback function, we just set logged in as true once we've got our user information. We'll need a handle logout function for our logout button. Here we set logged in to false and set the user back to its empty object form. And down below, we can just use a ternary operator. So if a user is logged in, we'll display their name, and we'll have a logout button. On click, handle logout. Let's add a little bit of styling so it looks a bit clearer, but don't worry, this will all change soon. And if a user is not logged in, we'll show the Google Sign In button. The user full name is a bit intense, isn't it? Let's use the first name instead. I remember it's something like given name. Let's check. Google loves their underscores. Okay, and when we click on log out, we get a bug. Let's see. Oh, it's in our useEffect. At the moment, we're just asking for it to render once, but actually it needs to render every time our logged in status changes. So we just need to add it in as a dependency. There we go. Much better. Next, let's have a context folder and a components folder. In our context folder, we'll have a useRecontext.js. Exactly like before, we just create a user context here, like this. And then we go back to app.js and wrap our code here inside userContext.provider. The value will be user and set user. Then let's add a header component in our components folder. We'll move our big chunk of code into our header component. And as part of the process, we need to drop down the props of logged in and set logged in. And copy and paste our logout function into our header component. If all of this feels like it's all moving a bit too fast, I recommend you going back a few videos and get more comfortable with how data is moved around the React app. It does take some time to get used to, so don't worry. And then let's use context here in our header. So const user set user equals useContext userContext. That's it. That's the user functionality done. Let's just update the styling to make it a bit more presentable. But we've used OAuth. We now have a fully functioning Google Log In button. We've decoded the JWT, JSON Web Token, to get our user information and have that stored in our useState, which we can now easily use across our components with the help of useContext that we've created. Now that our user header is looking a little bit better, let me show you how useRef can be used. This is just one use case, but what useRef does is that it allows values to persist between renders. It can be used to store a mutable value that does not cause a re-render when updated, or to access a DOM element directly. We import useRef from React. Then we just initialize a variable, say our sign-in button with useRef. In our sign-in button div, where we have ID equals sign-in, we can change this to ref equals curly braces sign-in button. We'll need to drop this into our header component, of course, which I'm doing it in reverse chronological order, but either way, it gets done. And finally, in our google.accounts.id.render button function, we just need to change this getElementById to signInButton.current. Everything still works. Good news. It's complaining about our image alt text, so let's just update that. Cool. I'm happy to leave that here. Now, the podcast player. Previously, we parsed RSS feeds through a package called RSS parser via our backend. Let me show you how it's done without the RSS parser so we can stay in our front end. We have to have a RSS URL. I found a tech podcast called Accidentally Tech Podcast and got the RSS URL for it. Here it is. We'll use useEffect. And first of all, we fetch the data from this RSS URL. We'll have a response. So then we take the text of that response, res, then we'll use JavaScript's own parser as our parser. So that's a new window.dom parser. The data is the parser, which will parse from string. And in the parentheses, we pass in the string in the format of text/XML. RSS feeds are in XML format, so that's why. Our item list will be all of our item tags within this data, and we push the required fields from each element into our items array. We're taking in title, pub date, MP3, and link by query selecting each field. All of this should be self-explanatory. And then let's set up a data and set data using useState and set our data as this array of items. Finally, our dependency for our useState will be RSS feed. If we console log data now, we can see that we have this massive array of data in exactly the format that we want. Fantastic! The dot is expected to be on the same line as the property. Okay, so let's amend that. Then we need to map our data into an episode component. This should be very familiar now if you've watched the other videos. This pub date here, we can actually get it into the format that I like up here when we're extracting the data. So to locale date string, British, numeric day, spelt out month, and numeric 4-digit year. Now in our episode component, we can just display the data. The audio. First thing to consider is if you want to do your own custom player or if you want to use JavaScript's built-in audio functionality. I went for the latter because for this mini app, I don't think we'd actually learn all that much from building out a custom player. It will only drag out this video. But let me know if you want to see how a custom player is done. So going with the easy option, we just need to do audio. Give it the MP3 URL as the source and add controls at the end. See?
It took
It works.
this long for something to break on the Land Rover.
Oh! There's two items, and they're both gigantic. I put the first one first, which is like, headset. This is the, what is it good for?
Absolutely nothing.
You've got your play, pause, duration, progress bar, volume control, and a little 3-dot menu. For something like this is all we need, really. Let's add some spacing around it so that it's less cramped.
It took this long for something to break on the Land Rover.
Oh, hooray, it's finally happened.
This car, I mean, I know you bought it used, but it was like how many miles and how many years old was it when you got it?
It was like a year and a half old and something like 15,000 or 20,000 miles, something like that.
It seems like things shouldn't be breaking yet, but anyway, go on.
It's the sunroof.
Oh, you know how much I love sunroofs.
No, don't tell him. Don't. Can you not? I will give you infinite money to not talk about this anymore, because the last thing I need is more of the anti-sunroof mafia to have ammunition to be against.
Next, some conditional rendering. We only want this podcast page to show when the user is logged in, right? So we can do a ternary operator here in our app.js. There we go. We can log in to see our podcast page, and when we log out, no one can access our podcast page. Just as a FYI, the audio sometimes is painfully slow to load because we're fetching all 522 episodes at once. In our episode component, we can add a label. Let's say make notes here or something. Then we can have a text area with a placeholder. We want it to be side by side with the podcast player, so let's update the styling to show that. We can add some simple styling to the text area. And set rows as 5. Now let's make it look a little bit neater. And to round it off, on our home screen, i.e. when no user is logged in, we will probably want to add some sort of image or text or whatever you want to our homepage. And to show off our useContext, we can also add a username into our episode component. Maybe in a label, like this. You know, little touches to personalize an app. As you can see, this is just a very bare bones of what a web app like this could achieve. You'd probably want a sidebar of some links, which you can use the React browser router for from our last video. You'd want to have a display of multiple podcasts and their podcast cover art, which you can get from each RSS feed and map it out in a grid. When you click on a podcast, you can come to a podcast page like this.
Hey, have we ever recorded this show before noon?
I would be surprised if John has ever recorded a podcast before noon.
No, I've done a bunch of morning ones for usually like people in the UK.
To flood fill an area with a pattern, does that not qualify for copyright because the program made the pattern and you didn't? You know, so that obviously I think using it, I think the output is copyrightable. But
and allow the user to listen and take notes. You can save the notes to local storage, or if you've learned about databases, you can save it to a database. This has the potential to look really, really good. So have a go and build it out from here. See you next time.